Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning, here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we're continuing on in our story of Moses in Exodus, and we're going to see what happens when Moses and Aaron confront Pharaoh and how he's going to respond. So without any further ado, let's get right in, starting in verse 1. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now, let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." Then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working." That same day Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people: "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Make the work harder for the people so that they will keep working and pay no attention to lies." Then the slave drivers and the overseers went out and said to the people, "This is what Pharaoh says: I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all." So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, "Complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had straw." And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers they had appointed, demanding, "Why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before?" Then the Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh. "Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told to make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people." Pharaoh said, "Lazy! That's what you are, lazy! That is why you keep saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks." The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told, "You are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day." When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." So here we have this passage where we see things aren't going well. We've had a couple chapters in a row where we had the great momentum of the burning bush and God's promises and how he was going to raise up Moses and then Aaron and how they were going to help lead the people out of Egypt. God was going to rescue his people, Israel. And yet we don't see that in this chapter. Instead of it going well, we see Moses and Aaron confront Pharaoh. They say, "This is what God says, let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "Of course, I'm going to listen to God." No, instead he says, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." We have to realize that there are people in our lives who don't recognize who God is. They don't know the Lord, just like Pharaoh here, and they don't care what God says. And that should be a startling reminder of our reality, that a lot of people choose to say, "I don't know the Lord," whether or not they actually do know that he exists. They choose to live this way, where they don't care, and they're not going to do what God says, and they're not going to treat us well. And we see that here with Pharaoh, because he not only says that I don't know the Lord, and why would I listen to him, he then turns around and makes the Egyptians force the Israelites to make the bricks they were making without straw, and that they had to still meet their quota. So not only does he reject God and reject what God's saying, but he then goes around and oppresses those who do believe in God and those who are trying to do what God says. So that should be a reminder for each of us in our lives that there are those people in our lives who are going to come against us when we're Christians because they don't want us to succeed. They're against our God and they're against us. And we see that demonstrated very well here with Pharaoh. We're going to see what happens to him as time goes on and how the Lord deals with him. But at the moment, he gets to turn around and treat the Israelites very, very poorly. And so we don't get to see that redemption moment or the rescuing that we were promised in previous chapters. Instead, we see what's going to happen when these Israelites are oppressed. And so we see later on in this passage that they are hard pressed by the Egyptians. They're forced to do this, and they can't do it. They can't meet that quota because they don't have the provisions that they need, and they have to go out and find the straw and yet still do as much work as they had been doing for the Egyptians. And so they come before, the Israelites, they come before Pharaoh, and they plead with him and say, "Why have you treated us this way?" And they try to get him to understand, to be rational, but instead Pharaoh just tells them that they are lazy, and that's why they're saying they need to go and worship God. He tells them, get back to work, and says they won't be given straw, they must still produce the full quota of bricks. And so it doesn't matter what kind of rationalization they give to Pharaoh. He is irrational at this moment. He's already decided that he is going to oppress these Israelites because he's worried that they're going to become too numerous and too powerful and that they might turn against them and take over them. And so he's oppressed them with slavery, but now he's going a step further, and he is oppressing them to the point of irrationality, where he is treating them terribly and asking and demanding the impossible from them, and blaming them that they can't do it. We have irrational people at times in our lives. I'm sure you've had an experience with people like that, where they don't care what's going on in your life. They don't care what's going on in reality. They just are demanding a certain outcome. And that's what Pharaoh's doing here. He is demanding a certain outcome of productivity. We might have that in our workplaces, where people demand certain things that we can't possibly do, and yet they demand it from us and blame us for why we can't do that. And so we have to realize there are people in our lives who are just irrational, and it usually is based on their foundation of not knowing the Lord, just like Pharaoh here. People act out of irrationality when they're out of tune with God. People act more rationally when they're in tune with God. They follow his principles. They follow what's in his word, the truth of his word. But that's not Pharaoh in this section. He is irrational because he has totally rejected God, totally rejected what God's demanded from him, and he is just going out and trying to be God himself and to oppress God's people. We go on further in this story, and we see that the Israelites, the overseers, they realize they're in trouble when they were told this. They leave Pharaoh, they find Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they say, "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You've made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Here's one of the first moments that we get to see the Israelites' stubbornness and the Israelites' irrationality themselves, where instead of trusting that God's going to take care of them, they constantly are moaning and groaning and complaining and resisting and wishing they could go back to the way things were before. And we usually look at them and think that they're crazy, but we find ourselves in their shoes on a day-to-day basis. We are whining and groaning and complaining whenever we think that God's not doing something. We ask him for help. We seek his guidance in an area of our life. We're praying for a miracle. We're praying for whatever, and we don't see him moving, and so we're just whining and complaining about what's going on in our life rather than trusting that God has a process and he has a plan. Because we flip back to the previous chapters and we know that God's already told his people through Moses and Aaron what he's going to do. He's already made it very clear. He's going to rescue them. He's going to save them. He's going to bring them out of the land of Egypt and into the promised land. But they don't get it. They don't trust him. They seemed to get at the end of the last chapter, like, yay, there was going to be hope, and then immediately they face adversity, just like so many of us do in our lives. When God gives us a promise, we immediately face the adversity that the enemy tries to throw against us. He throws something at us, and then immediately we react just like the Israelites and go, it's impossible. We want to go back to the way things were before. This is never going to happen. God's not really doing something. And yet, we should hold on, and we should realize when we read things like this story, we should realize how we shouldn't act and how we actually should act. We shouldn't act like the Israelites here and lose our faith. Instead, we should have faith and remain steadfast in our trust for the Lord and what he's going to do and in the plans he has for us. Because we're going to look in the next chapters in the coming weeks, and we're going to see how God is rescuing his people, how he does have a plan, and they get the benefits of that in the end if they would just be patient, if they would just trust in God, if they would just let him work in his timing and not theirs. So I want to encourage you to trust in God's timing this week, and whatever you're going through, keep the faith in the Lord no matter what your circumstances look like, because he is working behind the scenes sometimes, and we don't always get to see what's going on or how the plan's going to unfold, but we just need to trust in him. That's what he asks of us. So I want to encourage you to do that this week, and then join us next time as we continue on another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking.